If Mara Jennings hadn't looked up from table 12 at exactly the right second, a man would have died on the floor of Rosie's diner, and none of what followed would have ever happened. But she did look up, and in the 4 minutes that came after, her whole life turned a corner she never saw coming. Stay with me until the end of this one, because the ending is going to make your chest hurt in the best way. And if stories like this move you, do me a favor and hit subscribe before we start, because there's a lot more where this came from. It was a Tuesday, the kind of Tuesday that feels like it's made of wet cement. Rain had been falling on the small town of Coldwater Falls since dawn, and the diner windows were fogged from the inside out. Mara had been on her feet since 5 that morning, and her lower back had that dull throb it got every day around the 2 o'clock mark. She was 29 years old, with dark circles under her eyes that no amount of concealer could fully hide, and a smile she kept plastered on anyway, because customers didn't tip generously at a woman who looked as tired as she felt. She worked 6 days a week at Rosie's, a squat brick building on Main Street that had been serving coffee and meatloaf since before she was born. She rented a 1-bedroom apartment 2 blocks away, above a shuttered shoe repair shop, in a building owned by a man named Walter Higgins, who had, until 3 weeks ago, been threatening to raise the rent by $200 a month. Mara didn't have $200 extra. She barely had the current rent some months. Not with her mother's medical bills still trickling in from the hospital, stay 8 months back, and not with her little brother Dean's community college tuition due every semester like clockwork. She hadn't told anyone at work about the rent situation. She hadn't told anyone about much of anything, really. Mara had gotten good over the years at carrying weight quietly. Her father had left when she was 14. Her mother had gotten sick when Mara was 26. Somewhere in between, Mara had become the responsible one, the one who signed the forms and made the calls and figured out how to stretch a paycheck across 4 people's worth of needs. She didn't complain. She just worked. That particular Tuesday, the lunch rush had thinned to the usual afternoon stragglers. 2 retired school teachers arguing amiably over a crossword, a trucker parked at the counter with his 3rd cup of coffee, and in the back corner booth, a man Mara didn't recognize. He looked to be in his early 40s, broad-shouldered, wearing a charcoal gray coat that was a little too well-tailored for Coldwater Falls, where most people wore flannel and work boots. He had graying temples and the kind of face that looked like it didn't smile easily, though there was nothing unkind in it, just tired in a different way than Mara was tired. He'd come in alone around 1:30, ordered the chicken noodle soup and a club sandwich, and spent the whole meal frowning down at his phone like it had personally wronged him. Mara had refilled his water twice and gotten nothing but a distracted nod both times. She figured he was one of those consultants passing through on business, the kind who stopped in Coldwater Falls only because the Highway Diner 2 exits down was closed for renovation. She didn't think about him again until she heard the sound. It wasn't a shout. That was what made it dangerous. Choking rarely looks the way people expect from movies. There's no dramatic gasping, no clutching at the throat with a scream. Real choking is often silent because the airway that would carry a scream is the very thing that's blocked. What Mara heard was a strange scraping cough, cut off too fast, and then nothing. She looked up from table 12, where she'd been jotting down an order for 2 teenage girls who'd ridden their bikes over after school. Something in her stomach dropped before her brain even caught up to what she was seeing. The man in the charcoal coat was on his feet, one hand braced against the booth table, his face going from pink to a deep, alarming red, his eyes wide with the particular panic of someone who cannot make a single sound come out of his own body. Hey, are you okay?" Mara said, already moving, already knowing from the set of his shoulders and the silence of his open mouth that he was not okay, that this was the real thing, not a dramatic cough that would clear itself in a second. He shook his head. Once. Hard. His hand went to his throat. His lips had gone from red to a color Mara didn't like at all. "He's choking!" she shouted, more to alert the room than because she needed anyone's permission. The trucker at the counter spun around on his stool. One of the school teachers half rose from her seat, hand over her mouth. Mara had taken a first aid course 2 years ago, a free one offered through the community center, mostly because her manager, Rosie, had insisted the whole staff get certified after an incident with a kid and a chicken bone the year before. She hadn't thought about that course in months. Now every piece of it came rushing back at once, clean and clear, the way muscle memory does when it actually matters. "I'm going to help you, okay?" she said, stepping behind him, wrapping her arms around his midsection before he could even nod in response. He was tall. She had to reach up a little to get her fist positioned properly, just above his navel, below his ribs. Her hands were shaking, but her voice, when it came out, was steadier than she expected. 1, 2, 3. She thrust inward and upward, hard, the way she'd been taught on a plastic mannequin in a fluorescent-lit community center room that had smelled like old coffee. Nothing happened. The man's body jerked forward with the force of it, but his throat stayed silent, his face darkening further. "Come on," she muttered, not even sure if she was talking to him or to herself. She adjusted her grip, planted her feet wider, and thrust again. Still nothing. Someone in the diner was on the phone with 911. She could hear the trembling voice of one of the school teachers rattling off the address. Someone else had come around the counter. Mara didn't look. She couldn't afford to look away from what she was doing. Third thrust. The man made a sound, not the sound of air, but a sound of desperation, a kind of low groan that told Mara he was starting to lose consciousness. She had maybe seconds left, not minutes. She thought about her training, about how you're supposed to keep going, how giving up because it isn't working the first few times isn't an option. Fourth thrust. Fifth. On the sixth, something changed. She felt it more than heard it, a give in his body, and then a piece of chicken, mangled and wet, came flying out of his mouth and skittered across the linoleum floor. The man sucked in air with a horrible, beautiful, rattling gasp, the loudest and most wonderful sound Mara had ever heard a stranger make. His knees buckled. She caught him, or tried to, though he was easily twice her weight, and they both ended up sliding to the floor together in a heap, him gasping and coughing, her arms still wrapped around him like she hadn't quite processed that it was over. "You're okay," she kept saying, over and over, half to reassure him and half because she needed to hear it herself. "You're okay. You're okay. Breathe. Just breathe." He was shaking. His eyes were wet, whether from the ordeal or the lack of oxygen or something else entirely, Mara couldn't say. He looked at her, really looked at her, the way people rarely look at their waitress, and said, in a voice raw and cracked from the coughing, "You saved my life." "Just doing my job," Mara said, which wasn't really true because sticking a strange man in a Heimlich maneuver wasn't in her job description, but it was the kind of thing you say when you don't know what else to say and your hands are still trembling with adrenaline. The ambulance arrived 9 minutes later, 9 minutes that felt to Mara like they belonged to some other, slower version of time. The paramedics checked the man over, praised whoever had performed the Heimlich for likely saving his life, and gently suggested he go to the hospital to be checked for any injury to his esophagus or ribs from the force of the thrusts. He refused, politely but firmly. Said he felt fine, said he had somewhere he needed to be. Mara heard all of this from a slight distance. Sitting in a booth with a cup of water Rosie had pressed into her hands, her whole body starting to come down off the adrenaline in a slow, shaky wave. Before he left, the man in the charcoal coat came over to her booth. Up close, standing instead of choking, he looked different, steadier, more composed, the kind of person who was used to being in control of a room. He introduced himself as Daniel Hargrove. He thanked her again, more formally this time, and asked for her name. "Mara," she said. "Mara Jennings." "Mara Jennings," he repeated, like he was filing it away somewhere important. "I owe you something I can't really put into words, but I'm going to try to think of something anyway." She waved him off, embarrassed by the intensity of his gratitude, and told him it was nothing, that anyone would have done the same. He didn't look like he believed that. And honestly, neither did she. Not really. Not everyone keeps their head when a stranger's face turns purple in front of them. But she didn't say that. She just told him to take care of himself and to maybe cut his sandwiches into smaller pieces from now on, which got the first real laugh out of him she'd seen all day. He left a $100 bill on the table for a $14 meal and didn't wait for change. Mara didn't think much more about it after that, or she tried not to. The rest of her shift passed in a strange, floaty daze, the kind that comes after a jolt of fear followed by relief. Rosie sent her home early, told her she'd earned it, and Mara walked the 2 blocks back to her apartment in the rain without an umbrella, too tired and wrung out to care about getting wet. She didn't know, as she climbed the narrow stairs to her apartment above the old shoe repair shop, that in exactly 11 days, the name Daniel Hargrove would matter to her in a way she couldn't have imagined. She didn't know that the quiet, exhausted life she'd been carrying on her shoulders, the rent, the bills, her mother's medications, Dean's tuition, the endless arithmetic of not quite enough, was about to shift underneath her. Not all at once, but slowly, the way tectonic plates move, until suddenly the whole landscape looks different. For now, she just wanted a hot shower and 8 hours of sleep she wouldn't get. Because her mother called at 9 that night, needing help understanding a pharmacy bill, and Dean called at 10, needing to vent about a professor. And Mara, as always, picked up both times, because that was who she was, the girl who picked up. The woman who caught people when they were falling, one way or another, whether it was a stranger in a diner booth or her own family on the other end of a phone line. 11 days later, a letter arrived taped to the front door of the building where Mara lived, addressed to all tenants of 214 Maple Street. It was from a property management company Mara had never heard of, informing residents that ownership of the building had officially transferred, and that a mandatory meeting would be held in the building's small shared lobby the following Thursday evening to discuss updates to tenancy terms. Mara's stomach sank the moment she read it. Updates to tenancy terms, in her experience, was landlord language for rent hikes, new fees, or eviction notices, dressed up in polite paragraphs. Old Walter Higgins had been threatening a rent increase for months, grumbling about property taxes and maintenance costs every time Mara passed him in the hallway, and she'd assumed, with a kind of dull dread, that he'd finally sold the building to someone who was going to squeeze even harder. She spent the days leading up to the meeting running numbers in her head that never quite added up. If the rent went up by even $100, she'd have to pick up more shifts. And there weren't more shifts to pick up. Rosie's was a small diner in a small town, and Mara was already working 6 days a week. She thought about her mother's medication copays. She thought about Dean's tuition installment due at the end of the month. She thought, with a familiar tightening in her chest, about the fact that she had exactly $211 in her savings account, a number that had barely moved in 3 years, no matter how carefully she budgeted. Thursday evening came fast and unwelcome. The lobby of 214. Maple Street was a cramped, low-ceilinged space with a bank of dented mailboxes and a bulletin board that hadn't been updated since a bake sale flyer from the spring. About a dozen tenants had crowded in. The elderly Vasquez couple from the second floor, the young family with the baby who cried through the walls some nights, a college student named Ben who lived alone and worked nights at the gas station, and others Mara recognized by face, if not by name. Everyone had the same tight, worried expression she imagined was on her own face, too. A woman from the property management company stood at the front with a clipboard, explaining logistics. New maintenance request procedures, updated office hours, a new online portal for rent payments. Mara barely listened, waiting for the part that mattered, the part about money. And then the woman said that the new owner had actually asked to address the tenants personally, and that he'd be arriving shortly, running a few minutes behind after a meeting downtown. Mara felt her stomach twist tighter. A landlord who wanted to introduce himself in person was either extremely kind or extremely calculating, and in her experience, it was rarely the former. The lobby door opened, and a gust of cool evening air came in first, and then the man came in after it, shaking rain droplets from a charcoal gray coat, and Mara's whole body went still. It was him. Daniel Hargrove, the man from the diner. The man whose life she'd saved 11 days ago with her own 2 hands and a first aid course she'd almost forgotten she'd taken. For one long, suspended second, their eyes met across the crowded lobby, and Mara watched something shift in his face. Recognition. And then something warmer than recognition. Something that looked almost like relief. "Mara," he said out loud in front of everyone, before he'd even finished taking his coat off. Every head in that lobby turned toward her. Mara felt her face go hot. She hadn't told a single person about the diner incident beyond Rosie and a couple of co-workers. It hadn't seemed like the kind of story that needed repeating. Just something that had happened on an ordinary Tuesday and then folded itself back into the ordinary rhythm of her life. But apparently it hadn't folded away quite as completely as she thought, not for him. "You two know each other?" the property management woman asked, looking between them with polite confusion. "She saved my life," Daniel said simply. And the words landed in the small lobby with a weight that made the Vasquez couple exchange a startled glance and made Ben, the college student, actually look up from his phone for the first time all evening. 2 weeks ago at Rosie's Diner, I choked on a piece of chicken, and this woman, I didn't even know her name at the time, performed the Heimlich maneuver on me. Twice. 6 times, actually, before it worked. If she hadn't acted the way she did, as fast as she did, I would not be standing in this room today. The room had gone very quiet. Mara wanted to sink through the floor. She was not used to being the center of attention, and she especially wasn't used to it happening in the lobby of her own apartment building, in front of her neighbors, in front of the man who apparently now owned the roof over her head. "I didn't know you were the new owner," she managed to say, which was maybe the least important thing she could have said in that moment, but it was the only sentence her brain could produce. "I bought the building about a month ago," Daniel said, "before any of this happened. I run a small property investment firm. Nothing glamorous, mostly older residential buildings in towns like this one that I try to actually maintain instead of running into the ground for profit, which is rarer than it should be in this business. I've been meaning to come out and meet the tenants in person for weeks. Kept getting pulled back to the city for meetings. That Tuesday was actually going to be my one stop in Coldwater Falls before heading back. I figured I'd grab a quick lunch at the local diner, get a feel for the town." He paused, and something crossed his face that looked almost like disbelief at his own story, the strange coincidence of it. "I never imagined that lunch would nearly kill me, or that the woman who saved me would turn out to be one of my own tenants." Mara didn't know what to say. The whole room was looking at her like she'd done something extraordinary, which, she supposed, she had, though it hadn't felt extraordinary in the moment. It had felt like fear and training and muscle memory. Nothing more noble than that. Daniel turned back to address the room, though his eyes kept drifting back to Mara every few sentences. He explained that he bought the building intending modest, necessary updates, new locks, a repaired boiler that had been failing intermittently for years, updated fire safety measures, and that he had no plans to raise rents beyond a small annual adjustment tied to actual maintenance costs. Nothing like the aggressive increase some tenants had apparently been bracing for under the previous owner. Mara heard the collective exhale in the room, felt her own shoulders drop an inch from where they'd been hiked up near her ears for the past week. The meeting wrapped up not long after, tenants trickling out in 2s and 3s, murmuring relief to each other in the hallway. Mara lingered, not entirely sure why, straightening a stack of flyers on the bulletin board that didn't need straightening, until the lobby had mostly emptied and it was just her and Daniel and the property management woman who was gathering her things to leave. "Can I walk you up?" Daniel asked once they were alone. "I'd like to talk to you, if you have a few minutes. Not as your landlord, just as a person who owes you more than a fruit basket could ever cover." Mara laughed despite herself, the tension of the evening cracking a little. "You already left a $100 tip on a $14 lunch? I think we're square." "We are not square," he said. And there was something genuinely firm in his voice, not performative, not the polished gratitude of someone checking a box. "Mara, I have 2 kids, a daughter starting high school this year and a son who just started college. I have a sister I talk to every Sunday. I have a mother who still calls me by my childhood nickname and would be devastated, actually devastated, if I hadn't come home from that lunch. You didn't just save a stranger. You saved an entire web of people who love me, and none of them will ever get the chance to properly thank you because they don't even know your name. So let me thank you properly." They ended up sitting in the small lobby a while longer, the property management woman having quietly excused herself, the rain tapping steady against the front windows. Mara told him, without quite meaning to, more than she'd told almost anyone in months, about her mother's illness, about the medical bills that never seemed to shrink no matter how much she chipped away at them, about Dean's tuition and how proud she was of him, and how terrified she was that pride wouldn't be enough to actually get him through school, about the 6 days a week at Rosie's and the ache in her lower back that had become just another part of her body she'd learned to ignore. She didn't tell him these things to ask for anything. She told him because he asked, genuinely, and because something about the adrenaline of that Tuesday afternoon seemed to have burned away some of her usual instinct to keep her walls up. He listened in a way that felt different from the way most people listened, not waiting for his turn to talk, not offering the easy, hollow reassurances people give when they don't actually want to hear the hard parts. He just listened and asked another question and listened some more. In the weeks that followed, Daniel didn't disappear back to the city the way Mara half expected he would. He came back to Coldwater Falls more often than his business, by any reasonable measure required. He oversaw the boiler repair personally, standing in the basement in a coat that was once again too nice for the setting, asking the contractor pointed questions about the work instead of simply signing a check and leaving. He fixed the broken lock on the building's back door within a week of the meeting, something Walter Higgins had ignored for over a year. He asked Mara eventually if she'd be willing to help him understand what the building's tenants actually needed, since she'd lived among them, and he, despite his good intentions, was still an outsider learning the shape of a town he didn't grow up in. It became, without either of them quite naming it that way, a kind of friendship, careful, and a little formal at first, warming slowly the way things do when neither person is in a rush to name what's happening. Daniel would stop by Rosie's on the days he was in town, order the same club sandwich, cut into smaller, more manageable pieces now, a joke between them that never stopped being funny. Mara found herself looking forward to those visits in a way she didn't examine too closely, telling herself it was just nice to have a friendly face during the slow afternoon shifts, nothing more complicated than that. Then 3 months after the choking, on a day that started as unremarkably as any other, Mara's mother had a setback, a complication from her earlier illness that landed her back in the hospital for what the doctors called routine observation. But what felt to Mara like anything but routine. Mara left work in the middle of her shift for the first time in the 4 years she'd worked at Rosie's, hands shaking on the steering wheel the whole drive to the county hospital 40 minutes away, terrified in the particular bottomless way that only fear for a parent can produce. She spent that night in a hard plastic chair in a hospital hallway, And it was there, sometime past midnight, exhausted and hollowed out with worry, that she looked up to see Daniel walking down the corridor toward her, still in his work clothes, having driven the 40 minutes himself the second Rosie had called him, because Rosie, without telling Mara, had called him, had guessed correctly that he was someone Mara would want there, even if Mara herself would never have asked. He didn't say much. He sat down in the chair beside her, handed her a coffee from the vending machine that neither of them really wanted, and simply stayed the whole night until the doctors came out near dawn to say her mother would be all right, that the setback had been caught early and treated, that she'd likely be discharged within the week. Mara cried, finally, in that hospital hallway. 3 months of held-together composure breaking all at once, and Daniel didn't try to fix it or rush her through it. He just sat with her, the way she had once knelt on a diner floor and held a stranger through the worst 4 minutes of his life, and let her fall apart in the safest way a person can fall apart, with someone steady beside her who wasn't going anywhere. It was around then, in the slow, unglamorous aftermath of that hospital night, that Mara started to understand that whatever this was between them had stopped being simply gratitude a while ago. On both sides, though neither of them said so out loud for a while longer. The rest of the story unfolded the way good things sometimes do after a long stretch of hard ones. Not with a single dramatic turn, but with a series of small, steady kindnesses that accumulated into something real. Daniel quietly arranged, through a foundation his firm supported, a scholarship fund that ended up covering the remainder of Dean's tuition, structured carefully so it read as a merit award rather than charity, because he understood, without needing to be told, that Mara's pride mattered and needed to be respected, even while her circumstances were being eased. He never once framed it as something she owed him for. He framed it, when she finally found out and confronted him about it, with more gratitude than anger, as something he simply wanted to do. The way people who have more than enough sometimes choose to share it with people who have exactly enough to get by and not a cent more. He didn't raise the rent on 214 Maple Street beyond the modest, honest adjustment he promised that first night in the lobby. He fixed things that had been broken for years under the old ownership. The buzzing hallway light, the water heater that ran cold every winter, the cracked front step that had nearly tripped the elderly Mrs. Vasquez more than once. He became, without ever seeming to try particularly hard at it, the kind of landlord people in Coldwater Falls talked about, like he was a strange and welcome anomaly, a man who owned property, and somehow also seemed to actually care about the people living in it. And Mara kept working at Rosie's because she loved the rhythm of it, the regulars who knew her order before she opened her mouth, the particular satisfaction of a diner running well on a busy morning. But the desperate arithmetic that had defined so much of her life for so long, the endless subtraction that never seemed to leave enough remainder, began, slowly, to loosen its grip. Her mother's care stabilized. Dean graduated, eventually, debt-free, and got a job 40 minutes from Coldwater Falls, close enough to visit on Sundays. And somewhere in the middle of all of it, in a friendship that had grown roots deep enough to become something else entirely, Mara found herself, one evening nearly a year after that Tuesday at Rosie's, sitting across a different table from Daniel, not a diner booth this time, but a quiet restaurant 2 towns over, hearing him tell her, plainly and without any of his old formality, that he loved her, that he had for a long while now, and that he didn't want to spend one more day pretending. The word gratitude was big enough to hold what he actually felt. Mara thought, in that moment, about the Tuesday that had started it all. The rain against the diner windows, the scrape of a chair, the terrible silent panic of a stranger's face going the wrong color, the 6 thrusts it had taken before the world tipped back into its proper order. She thought about how close it had all come to never happening, how a single missed glance from table 12 could have meant a different, sadder story for a man's family she hadn't even known existed yet. She thought about how strange and unearned it felt that an act of instinct, 4 minutes of fear and training, had somehow unspooled into an entire life she hadn't known she was allowed to want. She said yes, not to a proposal that would come later on a spring afternoon by the same shared lobby where they'd first really seen each other, with the Vasquez couple watching from their window and pretending not to, but yes to him. Yes to whatever this was becoming. Yes to letting herself be caught for once, instead of always being the one doing the catching. If there's a lesson in any of this, it might be the simplest one there is. That the small, unglamorous acts of courage we perform on ordinary Tuesdays, the ones we don't even think of as brave while we're doing them, have a way of rippling out further than we could ever predict. Mara Jennings didn't save a stranger's life because she was hoping for anything in return. She did it because a man was choking, and she happened to know how to help. And that was enough of a reason on its own. Everything that came after, the friendship, the love, the slow unclenching of a life that had been holding its breath for years, was never the point. It was simply what happened when one tired, kind woman refused to look away from someone who needed her. On a rainy Tuesday afternoon that started out like every other day and ended up being the day that changed everything. If this story moved you even a little, don't forget to like it, share it with someone who needs a reminder that kindness still finds its way back to us, and subscribe for more stories just like this one, because there are so many more Maris and Daniels out there, and their stories deserve to be told too.